Welcome to the Zarlequan Infoverse!
I'm your host, Brad Schuhler, and our guest today is a well-known author and poet with a Master of Fine Arts from Goddard College, with over 20 years of experience as a professor, decorated with multiple awards in writing, both nationally and internationally. We are pleased to welcome Bill Cushing.
Oh, thanks for having me on board.
You're welcome.
Although I would make one correction. I don't think there's any poets well known.
Oh, well, what would you say the difference between poetry and writing is for you?
Geez. Well, for me, and being involved in poetry, I think has helped my writing in other areas.
Yeah.
So because poetry, it's at least from my angle, and I know not every poet is going to agree with it, but to me, it's the economy of language that you're trying to jam as much into every single word as you can. And, and I think that's the thing is, whereas any writer is told to cut and edit in poetry, it's like, yeah, you cut. Yes.
Keep cutting until, well,
stuff
you
out.
can't cut this and that's it. That's when you know to stop.
Yeah, that's about it. So, yeah, I don't know. I sort of fell into the poetry in a backwards way in many ways because of I mean, I never, if you had told me when I was starting school that I was going to be writing poetry, I would have said you were nuts. In fact, when I returned to school, I was planning on majoring in history.
Oh.
And then just got sidetracked into the writing by one of my first professors. And then he had me on the student newspaper, and we went to a convention, and there was a workshop on how to improve your writing. And the woman got up there and said, look, you want to improve your writing in any medium, start writing poetry, because it teaches you that, that idea, the discipline and almost miserly discipline, if you will, of writing. And it'll just translate into other things very easily. So I started, and I loved it. I fell in love with that particular genre of writing.
That's awesome.
Kept going.
So, what do you think, Bill, has originally inspired you to write?
Well, I always liked reading, and I did keep journals. I started when I was in high school. My intention was to major in journalism, and my dream was to be a sports writer for the New York Times, because I grew up in the city, and I was like, oh man, I'd love to cover the Jets and the Yankees and all that other stuff.
That's cool, yeah.
So I started at Missouri in the journalism program, but I had a little too good of a time and ended up flunking out my first semester. So from there, I enlisted in the Navy because Vietnam was going on at the time. And I figured, well, better to enlist than get drafted, get some measure of control over what happened.
Right.
And when I got out of the Navy, and it's kind of funny because when I went in the Navy, the idea was, I'll continue, pursuing journalism because they have a journalism corps.
Right.
And I got into boot camp, and when we went to go for what are you going to do after boot camp, I just got I said, well, I want to go to the journalism corps. And the guy just started laughing at me. He says, we don't need journalists. And I said, well, what am I qualified for? And he said, well, and I ended up becoming an electrician's mate and did that. And then when I got out, I loved the work so much, I just kept on with it for about another 10, 12 years. So it was, I was 37, I think, when I went back to school. But it mostly worked in the, marine trade as a marine electrician.
That's pretty cool.
Tankers and whatever.
A good set of skills to have,
Yeah, well, that's, I've always said, get a skill, because if the economy collapses, it's always going to be needed.
That is true.
But,
besides, if you need to rewire the house, you can, have a general idea of how to get that done.
Yeah. Not that I do that kind of thing anymore. Now I'm old and fat, so I have somebody else do that stuff.
So you were a professor at a couple different universities.
Yeah, well, community colleges was where I worked.
Okay.
And I sort of went in when I started my MFA, it was with the intention of teaching community college. I had been through it myself.
Yeah.
That was where I went back, and I really appreciated that avenue for students. I thought it was a great one. Smaller class sizes. Now you don't get the fancier classes because you're not at the university.
Right.
But I said, oh, that's fine. And then, so when I moved to California, I got my first job out here, teaching and which was at Mount San Antonio, and then picked up some others along the way because, well, what happened was, I was looking full time, but then we had our son was born and he had a lot of disabilities, and so my wife and I just said right at the outset, okay, bag the idea of full time jobs.
Yeah.
We got to devote time and energy to this guy, so we both went part time. And from there, so it's worked out well, I think.
Good. Good. So you've written a lot of different things. First started off with, what was it, Former Life?
Yeah, that
And
was
then
the first year.
Music Speaks. Just recently, a Little Cage of Bones, some poetry there. And then you have Two Brothers in Civil War and Time Well Spent coming out.
Yeah, those two are, and I'm working with the same publishers, Southern Arizona Press, who did Just a Little Cage of Bone. And I really liked working with. I got to give a shout out to Paul because he's been great to work with. Um, he works with you very much, but he knows when to step in and say, well, wait a minute, let's back up here and do this. Yeah. So we're trying to plan it so that both of them drop at the same time and maybe do a two for, sort of buy two, get a special deal on them. But each one is slightly different. The Time Well Spent is sort of collection of short stories of my own life.
Okay.
Actually starting from when I was an infant and then leading up to, in the last piece is an event that happened with my son when he got back to school, when he started school, which was really funny and a great story. So it's just all these different things that happened when I was in high school, when I was in the Navy, after this, on my way to flunking out of college. I got two good stories out of the experience.
That's good.
But the two brothers are actually, William Barker is the guy I was named after. They're both Cushings.
Okay.
Alonzo Cushing, who finally won the Medal of Honor back in, I think, 2014, I guess. And then William Barker, I was named after him. They were both involved in the Civil War. Well, actually, there's four brothers that were involved, but these two made the biggest mark. Alonzo in the Army and William in the Navy. So, and I always found those stories. I mean, William, I grew up with stories about him and I read lots of books and I had his journals and all this other stuff. And then Alonzo, well, when they started, there was a bunch of people that started campaigning that, look, you should give this guy the Medal of Honor, even though it's been 100 and something years, and you're outside. I think they put a time limit. Somebody said, look,
yeah. And
I think it was it Senator Feingold, out of Wisconsin, which is where he was from, was one of the guys leading the charge of making an exemption for this guy. And so a bunch of us, and I started a Facebook page, get him the Medal of Honor. So I learned more and more about him, of course, in the course of that. And their stories were so fascinating.
That's awesome.
I wrote about them, But the Time Well Spent, it's just a bunch of short stories. None of them are very long. I think the longest are maybe 10 or 12 pages long. Most of them are 5, 8 pages, something like that. And it's interesting because for some reason bars figure into a lot of them. There's one story called "Getting Drunk with Saint Nick."
Is that one of your favorites?
That was a good one. I think my
Yeah.
favorite is it's called the Captain Baseball and Me.
Okay.
And it's an event where I got to share some beers with Captain Kangaroo in a New York City bar uh, when the
You're talking
Yankees.
the Captain Kangaroo?
Yeah, yeah. And it was the funny part was I didn't even know who it was. I mean, when he left, because we met, it was in a bar in Penn Station. I was heading out to the North Shore. He was going to the South Shore. And we were following the Yankees at the time. This is 1978 when the Yankees had that great run against Boston. And I don't know if you remember that, but it was like they were 13 games behind and they caught up and ended up tying them. And, it became a really big World Series.
Impressive, yes.
Yeah. And so we met and we just started talking about the Yankees. And when he took off, the bartender goes, "You know who that was?" I said, he looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. Well, that was Captain Kangaroo. And I was like, oh my God. I was drinking beers with Captain Kangaroo.
There you go.
And it's funny because one of the other now this is not in the book, but I always love to brag about this one too, was I got to drink a whiskey with Joseph Heller.
Okay.
I Catch 22. And that was a fun night too.
What was the most interesting part of the conversation? What things stuck with you the most?
with Heller?
Yeah.
We didn't talk a whole lot because he had already suffered a pretty severe. He was in his 80s at this point.
Okay.
He had the stroke and he couldn't talk very well. But it was just the idea of being able to sit
Being there.
Yeah, to sit with him and share a drink with him. But it was really, he had come to give a lecture. I was at the university and he was part of the visiting writers series. And I was on the committee that helped bring him there. And of course, I was older last night. By the time I get to university, I'm 40 years old. So the faculty advisor told Heller, he says, "Look, you need anything, just go to this guy because he knows the ins and outs."
Right.
Because I'm not some 20-year-old kid just in school. Well, we go to the reception. It was the typical wine and cheese thing. And Heller comes up to me and goes, "Is there some place I can get a real drink around here?" And I just said, "Well, wait right there." I ran across the street to the liquor store, grabbed a small bottle of Chivas Regal, came back, and I said, "But the deal is you got to let me have a drink with you just because I want to be able to say I had one with you." And he was like, "No problem." But I had a stack of his books. He signed them all for me, even dedicated the Catch 22 to me, which was a real kick.
That's pretty cool.
But yeah, we didn't talk much because he'd just gotten through this lecture. He was really worn out, but it was just being able to sit there with this guy and, share a drink was really great for me. But
very cool moment. Something that definitely sticks with you, right?
Oh yeah. And I think that's the nice thing about getting into this is some of the people I've been able to meet and talk with. I mean, there's Heller, but I don't know if you know Philip Levine, pretty well-known poet. Got to meet him. Donald Justice. I mean, there's some really. I got to talk with Gwendolyn Brooks for a while, which was a big charge for me too. So, it is fun. And in the journalism part, it was kind of fun too, because I actually, when I was at community college, I ran a small arts and entertainment magazine in the town. And we would do interviews and got to do some really, meet some really interesting people, and mostly in music, but in the arts as well, visual arts, because we covered any artistic form there was.
Nice.
But anyhow,
such a variety,
yeah.
Yeah.
But anyhow, yeah, like I say, that time well spent, though, it is a bunch of short stories. I am actually in the process of, and it's going to be a long process of revising. I did write a memoir about my time in the Navy and then immediately afterwards, because I say I mostly worked on ships, but I also tended bar. I drove cabs, a lot of blue collar stuff. And there were some very weird stories come out of that. But that
and you kind of had a moniker too, didn't you, back in school?
Well, yeah, well, and when I was working, yeah. Oh, in school, yeah, they called. Well, it was funny because I was just thinking of something earlier. When I was working on ships,
Uh-huh.
the guys on the crew used to call me the professor because
Right.
we would go somewhere to work and I would go visit the art museums and go to the concerts and things like that while they were out drinking and all this stuff. But yeah, and then when I get into when I started the University of Central Florida and got into the poetry workshops, I said, "Man, you're like the blue collar poet." I said, well, I hadn't thought of it, but you write what you know, and this is what I've been doing up to this point. So,
Yeah.
uh, so yeah, it's kind of funny how the nicknames I got seem to be completely, contrary to the environment I was in.
It's okay though. It's
Yeah.
it's good to stand out, you
But
know?
yeah, it was. I could see, here again when I was, working, and then they called me the professor. I was like, well, it's kind of ribbon, but it's also they're acknowledging that, yeah, this guy's a little bit different from the rest of us.
Right.
So
Kind of a compliment, I'd say,
yeah,
you know?
yeah. But well, even when I was in high school, I was. In fact, I have friends today who say, "Oh, I couldn't have gotten through class without this guy," and that sort of thing. Because I went to a military school, and in fact, there's a story that I always love sharing once in a while. Is in a boarding school, of course, you get the Dear John letters.
Yeah.
The girlfriend breaks up with you. And one of the guys, when I guess it was my junior or senior year, but he gets this Dear John letter from his girlfriend, and he comes to me and he says, "Look, I really want to get even with her. How can I do that?" And I looked at the letter. I said, "Well, look, I tell you what, do you want to keep the letter?" And he goes, "Oh, no, absolutely not. I want to get rid of it." I said, "Okay, fine, let me have it." I took it that night. I took a red pen. I corrected all the mistakes in the letter
Uh-huh.
and said, "Here, send it back to her." Because I can't think of anything more insulting than having your breakup letter corrected for the grammatical errors.
And then send back.
And then send it back. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was like, "That's great." I was like, "Oh, yeah." Revenge can be taken in many ways. It doesn't have to be overt every time.
True, true.
But yeah, I've really enjoyed. I mean, now that I'm retired, and then of course our son has grown up, so he needs a lot less care than he's had before. And so now I've got the time to really devote to the writing. And the former life came out in 2019, but once we hit the lockdowns, I went nuts, and that's where I really got. I mean, it's funny because this year I will have published by the end of the year 4 different books.
Yeah.
Well, of course, they all weren't written this year. They're collections of stuff I've been working on for years, and just finally got a chance to assemble them and edit them and put them together into something that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
It's actually quite an advantage, huh?
yeah.
Being locked down.
Well, it was funny because I retired in February of 20, and then the lockdown
Oh,
started
wow. Yeah.
in
Okay.
March. And so, it was with the intent. Well, it's funny because the intention I had originally was my 50th high school reunion was coming up in April of 2020. So I told my wife, I said, "Look, every year we've gone, I'd been every 5 years. I said, every time I've gone, it's just been for the weekend. Why don't we just make a real vacation of it?" Because I went to high school in Philly, and of course I'm living out here in LA now. And I
Okay.
said, we can do something where I'll retire. We can take like 2 weeks. My plan was we fly into Harrisburg, drive over to Gettysburg, spend a few days at the battlefields there because she'd never been. Uh, then drive in from Harrisburg or from Gettysburg over to Philly, spend a few days in Philly doing the touristy stuff there, and then we do the reunion that weekend. And then we had made arrangements. I had made arrangements with my sister who lives in Virginia now, and I said, well, we can get together. We can meet in D.C. and get together for a few days because I told my sister, I said, look, we haven't gotten together socially in years. I mean, every time we've
Yeah.
gotten together, it's for a burial or something like that. It's like, we just hang out and have some dinner and get some drinks. Well, of course, that all got blown up by the lockdown,
Right.
but at least the timing was right. When I didn't have to worry about work or anything. I had it all set up and ready to go. So I was getting paid. I had my retirement coming in, my Social Security, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it worked out well.
So, what is one of the things that you might share with aspiring writer, insight that maybe you got that you wish somebody might have given you?
Hmm. Well, I would say don't throw anything away, but that wasn't any advice I needed. So, in fact, much to the chagrin of my wife, I still have things from like 1970s hanging around. I'm absolutely convinced they'll become useful. Um, but I don't know. I think the biggest thing, and now that I'm teaching it, I've always said, look, the biggest task in writing is the rewriting. You got to be willing to get back in there, look at it. And, one of the nicest or coolest sayings I've seen over the years was, and I don't know who said it, but it's great. It says, "What is it? Write without fear, edit without mercy." Uh,
Yeah.
and it's that idea of, yeah, even if you're producing garbage, you can always work with it. And I think that's maybe one of the big things is, and probably the thing I've learned over the years
Yeah.
is don't try and start with the finished product. That's one of the things I say
Right.
about writing all the time is like, no, that's not what writing's about. The
Well,
first
similar
draft, yeah,
similar to like, somebody doing a painting. They don't
yeah,
do it the first time. They go over it, develop it,
yeah. You sketch
hone
it.
it.
Yeah, yeah,
I liked that part. I'll accentuate that. No, no, not this. We'll kind of
yeah,
change the direction.
yeah, yeah. But that, yeah, I think that's one of the things that I think people have the hardest time with. And I think a lot of it is rooted in this fact that most of us grow up hearing the mantra, if you're not going to do it right the first time, don't do it at all. I'm like, oh, that's crazy.
That's true, because that's not how life works. That's not
And
really
it
even
isn't. Yeah.
how
In fact,
success works.
one of the examples I use when I'm in class is I say, look, if anybody here plays basketball, if you have a turnaround jump shot, you didn't start with that. You threw a lot of bricks.
Right. That's true.
You had to work at it. And, that's something that you just have to keep at it, doing it over and over again. Repetition is the key. But that willingness, yeah, to me, 80% of writing is the revision. The writing part, that's the easy part.
Yeah.
Revising, that's the work. And you got to be willing to go in there and say, look, this isn't working, or being open to people saying it's not working.
Right.
I'm with two different writing groups now, and I'm a big believer in those. One of them is strictly poetry, and the other one is all kinds of stuff, mostly fiction. But I'm doing a lot of the nonfiction stuff with them, and getting that feedback. Now, I think you got to have people that you respect doing that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you got to go through a few groups or meetings to figure out, okay, this is a group I click with and I work with well. And, I'm getting what I want out of it. But yeah,
Right.
I'm a big believer in that, getting outside work, outside eyes, looking at your stuff, which is, what I do all the time now. So yeah, I think that's probably the hardest thing for a lot of people just getting into writing to accept is like, your stuff ain't going to be great, not to begin with. And it's never going to be perfect. I don't think there's I always like to say the last time we see perfection would probably be Nadia Comaneci. So, it just doesn't happen that often. I mean, maybe
Right.
I think some of Michelangelo's stuff you can say is near perfect. Mozart's music is as close to perfect as you're going to get. But,
Yeah.
even the greatest writers will admit, no, it didn't start out this way. And I'm trying to remember the novelist who says once she's a pretty big name novelist. I can't remember her name right now. But she said, once a book is published, I never look at it again. because otherwise I'll just spend the whole time complaining about all the mistakes I made. So
Like, I could
this
have
is
done
how,
this, and
yeah,
I should have done that. Yeah.
So you just let it ride, get to work on the next one.
And that's a good philosophy. That's something that is, I think, valuable to share. It goes in layers. It doesn't happen
Oh,
overnight,
no,
and the finished product isn't what you start off with. It changes as you go.
and if it does, and that's funny because I remember when I first started writing poetry, and like I say, I was in community college at the time, and there was a bar I used to go to all the time because I covered a lot of acts that would show up there for the school newspaper, and I got to know the people there pretty well. And one night I was there, and the bartender told me, he said, "Oh, let me introduce this guy. You'll get along with him. He writes poetry too." I said, "Okay, fine." And I talked with the guy. Well, of course, my big lesson there is just because I share an activity with somebody doesn't mean I'm going to get along with them necessarily. But I remember the first thing I asked him was, have you had any luck getting published? And he goes, "Well, the Atlantic Monthly wanted to publish one of my poems, but they wanted to change a line in there. And I told them, no, I'm not going to do that."
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, man, if the Atlantic Monthly is going to publish my poem, they can change any bloody thing they want. And I was starting to think, yeah, that doesn't sound like, I'm not buying that. And then later on, I asked him, I said, "Well, what's your writing process?" And he says, "Well, I write it the first time and it just comes out the way I want." And I'm thinking, you're either full of it or you've got the lowest standards in the world then, because that's the only way any writer would come out and say that with a straight face.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, the only thing I can think of that was written on the fly would be On the Road, Kerouac's novel, because I don't know if you know the story, but yeah, he was typing out pages. As soon as he was typing them out, Ginsberg was running them down to the publisher, for typesetting and stuff. So
yeah.
yes. And if you read it, and I reread it later, I said, yeah, it is rough. It's not perfect, but it was good for the time, as a good reflection of that era.
Kind of more stream of consciousness, sort of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even the stream of consciousness stuff, those guys edited that up and down. But yeah, it's, never try and start with a finished product. That's, and I'm not going to say it's never going to happen. I've had a couple of incidences where I've had two poems that, not that they didn't go through some changes, but,
they came out exactly the way.
But that's, you can't, it'd be sort of like, I'm going to get my kids' college fund started by playing the lottery. No, you're not going to bank your life on that.
Not
premise.
A solid plan. Yeah, not a solid plan.
But
well, Bill, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
No, hopefully, if anybody's interested, they'll take a look at these. I'm really optimistic about the two brothers. I think that one I really feel good about. Not just because it's such a personal project, but also it is interesting that these two guys that were in the same family, they were devoted to each other. No two could be more different than each other. I mean, where one was very, formal, really followed the rules. The other one, William, was just, he got kicked out of Annapolis for discipline problems. So, and yet when the Civil War broke out, they needed people so badly they took him back. And he ended up becoming one of their greatest warriors, really, in many ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hope people, take a look at all of my stuff. Well, the Music Speaks is a slightly different volume because that's all. I love music. I work with a musician. And all those poems are music related. But the others, the Former Life and the Just a Little Cage of Bone, clearly are, I'm getting older, I'm looking back at life, and this is what my life was like. And here again, the time well spent is a bunch of memories, but yeah, it's also, I think, a look at, here's a guy who grew up in the last half of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of I'm hoping younger writers look like, geez, that's what life was like.
Yeah. Just a sampling.
Yeah, where you could go out and hitchhike up and down the country. And,
Right.
and, you could do certain things that you just can't do anymore.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a time capsule thing, I guess.
I like it.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Bill. We
Thanks.
appreciate your time, and we will talk with you soon.
Oh, great. And hopefully maybe I can send you the links to the books if I don't know if
That would be great.
Sort of thing, but I will certainly always willing to sell books.
It's always a good thing.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much.
You're welcome, Bill. Have a great one.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this enlightening episode of the Zarlequan podcast. Remember to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss a beat. The Zarlequan Indieverse.